The mountain looked perfect that morning. Fresh powder, clear blue skies, and not too many people on the slopes yet. David stood at the top of the advanced run, adjusting his expensive goggles and feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline. This was his escape. The one place where he didn't have to think about quarterly reports or board meetings or the 1,000 emails waiting in his inbox. He was 42 and running a tech company worth close to $50 million. Life was good. Better than good, actually. He had the corner office with views of the city, a beautiful home in the best neighborhood, and respect from everyone in his industry. People listened when he talked. They asked for his advice. They wanted to be him. The ski run stretched out below him, challenging but manageable for someone with his experience. He'd been skiing since college, always pushing himself to go faster, take bigger risks. That's how he'd built his business too. Big risks, big rewards. It had worked out pretty well so far. He pushed off, feeling the cold air against his face as he picked up speed. The snow was perfect, and for a few moments everything felt right. This was freedom. This was control. This was life at its best. Then he saw the patch of ice. It happened so fast. 1 second he was carving confidently down the slope. The next, his skis hit that icy section and he was airborne. Not in the good way, not like a planned jump. This was chaotic, terrifying, completely out of control. He hit the ground hard, really hard. There was a sound, a crack that he felt more than heard, and then pain unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It shot through his back, his legs, everywhere. He tried to move but couldn't. Tried to get up, but his body wouldn't respond. People were shouting. Ski patrol was there within minutes, their faces serious as they stabilized him and called for emergency transport. The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and confusion. David kept trying to move his legs, kept willing them to respond, but it was like they weren't there anymore, like they'd stopped being part of his body. The emergency room was chaos. Doctors, nurses, machines beeping, people asking him questions he could barely process. They did scans, lots of scans. He heard terms like spinal cord injury and vertebrae damage, but his mind couldn't quite grasp what they meant for him. When the surgeon finally sat down to talk to him 3 days later, David was on so many pain medications that everything felt distant and unreal. The injury to your spine was severe, the doctor said, his voice gentle but direct. We've done everything we can surgically, but the damage to the spinal cord means you've lost function below the waist. David stared at him. What does that mean? When will I walk again? The doctor's expression said everything before his words did. The likelihood of regaining that function is very small. We'll do physical therapy, of course, and there's always hope for some improvement, but you need to prepare yourself for the reality that this might be permanent. Permanent. The word hit harder than the impact on the mountain had. I have a company to run, David said, as if that somehow changed the medical facts. I have meetings next week. I can't be in a wheelchair, but he was. And as the weeks passed in the rehabilitation facility, the reality of his new life began to sink in. Everything was different. Getting dressed took forever and required help. Going to the bathroom required help. Moving from the bed to the chair required help. He'd gone from being the guy everyone looked up to, the guy who had it all figured out, to someone who couldn't even take a shower by himself. His wife visited less and less. At first, she came every day looking worried and supportive. But as the days turned into weeks, he could see the reality hitting her too. This wasn't temporary. This was their new life, and she hadn't signed up for this. The conversations got harder. She'd talk about practical things, about how they'd need to modify the house, about how maybe he should consider stepping back from the company for a while. But underneath all those practical discussions, David could feel something else. Fear, resentment, a growing distance that had nothing to do with the physical space between them. 3 months after the accident, she asked for a divorce. They were sitting in the living room of their home, which David had only recently been allowed to return to. The house that had once felt like a castle now felt like a prison. Everything was too high, too difficult to reach, too designed for a person who could walk. I can't do this, she said, not meeting his eyes. I've tried, David, I really have. But this isn't the life I want. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me. The kids were upstairs, teenagers who barely knew how to talk to their father anymore, who looked uncomfortable every time they saw him in the wheelchair, who had their own lives and friends and problems, and didn't know how to fit this new version of their dad into that picture. What about the kids? David asked, his voice hollow. They'll visit, she said, but they both knew that was probably a lie, or at best a hope that wouldn't quite work out the way they imagined. The divorce was quick. She got the house, which made sense since it wasn't accessible for him anyway. She got primary custody of the kids, which hurt, but also felt inevitable. They were already pulling away from him, embarrassed by his condition, uncomfortable with the reality of disability. He got a settlement that seemed generous until he started paying medical bills. Insurance covered a lot, but not everything. Not the modifications he needed for whatever place he ended up living. Not all the therapy sessions. Not the equipment he'd need for the rest of his life. The company was next to go. The board called a meeting 6 months after his accident. They were sympathetic, of course. They acknowledged everything he'd built, everything he'd contributed, but they had concerns about the future, about his ability to lead effectively, about the image they needed to project to investors. "We think it's best if you step back," the chairman said, using words that sounded kind but meant only one thing. They were pushing him out. David fought it at first. Threatened lawyers, reminded them of contracts and agreements, but the fight took energy he didn't have. And deep down, he knew they'd already made up their minds. They didn't see him as capable anymore. The wheelchair changed how they viewed everything about him. He took the buyout. It was less than he deserved, less than his shares were worth, but fighting would have cost more in legal fees than he'd gain. And he was tired. So tired of fighting, of trying to prove he was still the same person, of watching people look at him with pity instead of respect. Friends disappeared too. The guys he used to play golf with stopped calling. Business contacts who used to seek his advice suddenly had nothing to say. Invitations to events dried up. Maybe they didn't know what to say. Maybe they were uncomfortable around disability. Maybe they just didn't see him as useful anymore. David ended up in a large apartment modified for wheelchair access, with more space than he needed and more silence than he could stand. His savings were shrinking faster than he'd expected. Medical bills kept coming. The legal fees from the divorce had been substantial. The buyout from the company had seemed like a lot until he started actually living on it. He spent his days moving from room to room, finding small tasks to fill the hours. Physical therapy appointments broke up the week, but they felt pointless. The therapists were encouraging, talking about maintaining strength and mobility, but David could see the truth in their eyes. This was management, not recovery. This was about learning to live with limitation, not about getting better. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket. He stopped showering regularly, stopped bothering to shave. What was the point? Nobody saw him anyway. Nobody cared. The kids called sometimes, awkward conversations where neither side knew what to say. They'd visit once a month, duty visits that felt forced and uncomfortable. They'd stay for an hour, talk about school and friends, then leave looking relieved to escape. David had hired professional caregivers to help with daily tasks. They came and went, efficient and professional, but distant. They did their jobs, helped him with the things he couldn't manage alone, then left. None of them lasted long. David knew he was difficult, knew his bitterness made him hard to be around, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. One caregiver quit after he threw a book across the room in frustration. Another left after he spent an entire week barely speaking, his depression so heavy he could barely function. A third made it almost 2 months before deciding the pay wasn't worth dealing with his mood swings. His lawyer finally called with what sounded like exasperation in his voice. "I think I might have someone," he said. "But David, you need to actually work with this one. You're burning through caregivers faster than I can find them." "What makes this one different?" David asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "He's not like the others. He's doing this to support his kid, not as a career. He's been through some stuff himself. Might understand where you're coming from better than the professionals." David almost said no, almost told his lawyer to forget it, that he'd rather struggle alone than deal with another stranger in his space. But the truth was he needed help. He couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep pushing people away while simultaneously drowning in isolation. "Fine," he said. "Send him over." He had no idea that decision would change everything. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 in the morning. David had been awake for hours already, unable to sleep past 5 these days. Insomnia was just another gift from his new life. He wheeled himself to the door, taking his time. Let whoever it was wait. He wasn't in any hurry. When he opened the door, he found a man about his own age, maybe a few years younger, wearing jeans and a simple blue shirt. He had dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and not enough rest. But his smile was genuine, warm in a way that immediately made David suspicious. Nobody smiled like that without wanting something. "Good morning," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Tommy, your lawyer sent me." David looked at the offered hand but didn't take it. "You're the caregiver?" If Tommy was offended by the rudeness, he didn't show it. He lowered his hand naturally, his smile never wavering. "That's right. Mind if I come in?" David wheeled backward, gesturing for Tommy to enter. The apartment was a mess. David hadn't bothered picking up in days. Empty takeout containers sat on the coffee table. Mail lay unopened in piles and the curtains were drawn even though it was a beautiful morning outside. Tommy looked around but didn't comment on the mess. Instead, he walked to the windows and pulled open the curtains, letting sunlight flood the room. David winced at the brightness. "What are you doing?" David asked irritably. "Letting some light in," Tommy said simply. "It's a nice day. Seems wrong to waste it sitting in the dark." "I didn't invite you here to redecorate," David snapped. Tommy turned to face him, and for the first time David saw something in his eyes that wasn't pity or discomfort. It was understanding, maybe even recognition, like he'd seen this kind of anger before and knew exactly what it was covering up. "You're right," Tommy said, sitting down on the couch without asking permission. "You invited me here for an interview, so let's do that. What do you want to know?" David was thrown off balance by Tommy's directness. Most caregivers came in being overly nice, tiptoeing around him like he was made of glass. This guy seemed comfortable, almost too comfortable. "What are your qualifications?" David asked, falling back on the business approach. "Facts, credentials, measurable things." "I've got basic caregiver certification," Tommy said. "Took the course 2 years ago. I've been working with 3 clients since then, helping with daily activities, medication management, that kind of thing." "That's it?" David couldn't keep the disdain out of his voice. 2 years experience and a basic certification? Do you know who I am? What I built before all this?" He gestured angrily at his legs, at the wheelchair. "I know you ran a tech company," Tommy said calmly. "Your lawyer told me. But I'm not here to work for the person you used to be. I'm here to help the person you are now if you'll let me." The words hit harder than David expected. He felt his anger rising. That familiar heat that had been his constant companion for months. "The person I am now," he repeated bitterly. "You mean the guy who can't walk? Who can't do basic things without help? Who's been abandoned by everyone who used to matter in his life?" "I mean the person sitting in front of me," Tommy said, his voice steady. "The one who's clearly going through something difficult and needs some support." "That's all." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Support. That's a nice word for it. You're here for the paycheck. Let's not pretend it's anything else." "You're right," Tommy said, surprising him again with honesty. "I do need the money. I'm a single dad with an 8-year-old daughter who needs food, clothes, and a roof over her head. I work 3 part-time jobs to make that happen. So yes, I need this job." Something in the way Tommy said it without shame or apology made David pause. At least the guy was honest. "Why 3 jobs?" David asked despite himself. "Why not just 1 full-time position?" "Because full-time positions have set hours and my daughter's needs don't follow a schedule. Part-time work gives me flexibility. I can be there when she gets home from school, take her to doctor appointments, stay home when she's sick. It's not ideal, but it works." David studied Tommy more carefully. The tired eyes made more sense now. So did the worn jeans and the simple shirt. This wasn't someone coasting through life. This was someone fighting for it. "Where's her mother?" David asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. But Tommy didn't seem bothered. "She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer, it was fast, which I guess was a mercy in some ways. But it left just me and my daughter figuring things out." The room fell quiet. David felt his anger deflating slightly, replaced by something more complicated. This guy had real problems, real losses, and he was sitting here asking for a job without any self-pity or expectation of sympathy. "I'm not easy to work with," David said finally. "I'm angry most of the time. I say things I don't mean. The last 3 caregivers quit because they couldn't handle me." "I heard," Tommy said with a slight smile. "Your lawyer warned me. Said you were difficult and bitter and probably wouldn't last a week before firing me. And you still came?" "I need the job," Tommy repeated. "And honestly, angry I can handle." My wife was furious near the end. At the cancer, at the unfairness of it, at having to leave our daughter. She said terrible things sometimes, things that weren't really her but were just the fear and pain talking. I learned not to take it personally. David didn't know what to say to that. He'd expected someone timid, someone who'd cower when he lashed out. Instead, he got someone who seemed to understand exactly where the anger came from. I don't need sympathy, David said, testing. Good, because I wasn't planning to give you any, Tommy replied. What I can give you is practical help with the things you need, and maybe some company so you're not sitting alone in the dark all day. Beyond that, you're on your own. Despite himself, David felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something. When can you start? He asked. How about now? Tommy stood up and looked around. Let's start by cleaning up this place. Then we can talk about what you actually need help with versus what you just haven't bothered trying. And just like that, Tommy was in his life. The first few weeks were rough. David tested Tommy constantly, pushing boundaries to see where he'd break. He'd refuse to cooperate with basic care routines, complain about everything, make unreasonable demands at odd hours. Tommy never rose to the bait. He'd simply state what needed to happen, give David space to decide how difficult he wanted to make it, then proceed with quiet efficiency. When David was particularly nasty, Tommy would just look at him with those tired, knowing eyes and say something like, "You done? Because we still need to get through this either way." It was infuriating and oddly comforting at the same time. Tommy brought structure to David's days. Morning routine at the same time every day, meals at regular intervals, actually nutritious meals instead of takeout, physical therapy exercises that David had been skipping. Tommy pushed him without being pushy, encouraged without being patronizing. But what really started breaking through David's walls was the way Tommy treated him. Not like a patient or a disability case or someone to be pitied, just like a person. A difficult person sometimes, sure, but still just a person. Tommy would argue with him about sports, make jokes that weren't careful or filtered, ask his opinion about business stuff related to Tommy's own life, talk about his daughter's school problems like David might actually have useful input. One morning, about 3 weeks in, Tommy showed up looking more exhausted than usual. Rough night? David asked, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. Tommy rubbed his face. My daughter had nightmares. Happens sometimes. She has trouble sleeping when she's stressed about school stuff. What kind of school stuff? Math, Tommy said with a tired smile. She's struggling with fractions and I'm not much help. Math was never my strong subject. David found himself thinking about it throughout the morning. That afternoon, when Tommy brought lunch, David spoke up. I could help, he said abruptly, with the math. I mean, if you want. I used to be good at that stuff. Tommy looked surprised, then genuinely pleased. Yeah, that would be amazing. She's been getting frustrated and I hate that I can't help her with it. Bring her by sometime, David said, then immediately wondered if he'd made a mistake. He didn't do well with kids anymore. His own barely wanted to be around him. But the following week, Tommy showed up with a little girl who had her father's warm smile and her mother's dark curls. According to the photo Tommy had shown him. This is Lily. Tommy introduced her. Lily, this is David. David expected the usual reaction from kids. The awkward staring at the wheelchair. The questions they weren't supposed to ask. The discomfort that adults tried to hide but children couldn't. Instead, Lily walked right up to him and said, Hi. Dad says you're really smart and can help me with fractions. I hate fractions. David found himself smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in months. Yeah, well, maybe we can make them less terrible. They spent an hour working through her homework. Lily was bright, just approaching the problems wrong. David found himself getting into it, finding ways to explain that made sense to her. When she finally got a problem right on her own, she lit up with pride. I did it, she announced. Dad, I actually understand it now. Tommy was watching from the kitchen, and when David looked over, he saw genuine gratitude in the man's eyes. Not pity, not sympathy, just thanks from one person to another who'd helped with something important. After they left, David sat in his apartment feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Useful. Like he'd contributed something that mattered, even if it was just helping a kid with math homework. That night, for the first time since the accident, David actually looked forward to the next day. The good days didn't last. That's what David learned about recovery or whatever this was. You'd have a few moments where things felt almost normal, where you could forget about the wheelchair and the limitations and the life you'd lost. And then something would slam you back down into reality. For David, that moment came on a Wednesday morning about 2 months after Tommy started working for him. His ex-wife called. The kids wanted to cancel their weekend visit. Again. Some excuse about a school event and a friend's birthday party. It was the third cancellation in a row, and they all knew what it really meant. The kids were pulling away, finding it easier to forget about their father than to deal with the discomfort of his disability. After the call ended, David just sat there staring at his phone. All the progress he'd made, all the small steps forward, suddenly felt meaningless. What was the point of getting better if his own children didn't want to be around him? What was the point of any of it? Tommy showed up for his shift and immediately knew something was wrong. David's face was different. Closed off in a way it hadn't been in weeks. What happened? Tommy asked, setting down his bag. Nothing, David said flatly. Just leave me alone today. Can't do that. We've got your therapy appointment in an hour. Cancel it. David, I said cancel it. The words came out as a shout, harsh and angry. Just leave me alone. I don't need you here. I don't need therapy. I don't need any of this. Tommy stood there quietly for a moment. Then he did something David didn't expect. He sat down on the couch, settled in like he was planning to stay a while, and just waited. What are you doing? David demanded, sitting here until you're ready to talk about whatever's actually bothering you. I don't want to talk, okay? Tommy pulled out his phone and started scrolling through it casually, like he had all day. The silence stretched out. David's anger built, looking for an outlet. He wanted Tommy to leave so he could wallow in his misery alone. He wanted to break something, scream at someone, make the world feel as terrible as he felt inside. My kids don't want to see me, he finally said, the words bitter in his mouth. They canceled. Again. Tommy looked up from his phone, his expression understanding. That's hard. Hard? David laughed harshly. It's more than hard. They can't stand to be around me. Their own father, and they'd rather do literally anything else than spend a few hours with me. They're teenagers, Tommy offered gently. Don't. David's voice was sharp. Don't make excuses for them. Don't tell me it's just a phase or they'll come around. You don't know that. Nobody knows that. Tommy nodded, accepting the anger without defending himself. You're right. I don't know that. The acknowledgement somehow made it worse. David felt everything he'd been holding back start to break through the walls he'd carefully built. I've lost everything, he said, his voice cracking. My wife, my kids, my company, my body. Everything that made me who I was is gone. And for what? So I can sit here learning how to live half a life. So I can pretend like any of this matters. Does it matter? Tommy asked quietly. Does what matter? Living half a life, as you put it. Does it matter? David stared at him. I don't know anymore. Some days I think it does. Like when I'm helping Lily with homework or when we're talking about your business ideas. But then something like this happens and I remember that I'm just broken. And no amount of pretending otherwise changes that. The words hung in the air between them. David felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd been avoiding for months. He waited for Tommy to offer some inspirational speech, some platitude about how things would get better or how he needed to stay positive. Instead, Tommy said, I felt like that after my wife died. David looked up, surprised. It was about 4 months after, Tommy continued, his voice steady but soft. Lily was 5 and she was struggling. Nightmares every night, crying for her mom, asking questions I couldn't answer. I was working 2 jobs, barely sleeping, trying to hold everything together. And one morning I just broke. He paused, looking down at his hands. I sat in my car before work and just sobbed. Couldn't stop. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't see any reason to keep going. I had nothing left. No wife, no savings, no energy, no hope. Just a scared little girl who needed me to be someone I didn't know how to be anymore. David found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the honesty in Tommy's voice. What did you do? He asked. I went to work, Tommy said with a sad smile, because I didn't have a choice. And I came home to Lily, and I did it again the next day, and the day after that. Not because I felt better, or found some meaning or had some breakthrough, just because she needed me to. He looked directly at David now. But here's the thing. Somewhere in all those days of just surviving, just putting one foot in front of the other, I started having moments, small ones. Lily would laugh at something stupid I said, Or I'd actually taste the food I was eating instead of just shoveling it in. Or I'd notice the sunset was pretty. Tiny little moments that didn't fix anything but reminded me that life still had texture, flavor, something. David felt his eyes burning. He blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of Tommy. Your kid's canceled, Tommy continued. That hurts. It's supposed to hurt. But it's not the whole story. They're teenagers dealing with their own stuff. They're scared and confused and don't know how to handle what happened to you. That doesn't mean they don't love you. It just means they're struggling too. They shouldn't have to struggle with this, David said, his voice rough. They should have a normal father. They have the father they have, Tommy said simply. Not the one you used to be. Not some perfect version you wish you could be. Just you as you are right now, and maybe that feels like not enough, but it's what there is. The words were harsh but not unkind. They carried a truth that David had been avoiding. I don't know how to be this person, David admitted, finally saying out loud what he'd been thinking for months. I don't know how to be the guy in the wheelchair who needs help with everything. That's not who I am. Then who are you? Tommy asked. David opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. He didn't know anymore. All his life he'd defined himself by what he did. His career, his success, his physical abilities. Without those things, who was he? I don't know, he said finally, the admission feeling like defeat. That's okay, Tommy said. You don't have to know right now. You can figure it out as you go. David felt something break inside him then. All the grief and anger and fear he'd been holding back came rushing forward. He doubled over, his face in his hands, and sobbed. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal and hurt. Tommy didn't try to stop him or comfort him with empty words. He just moved to sit beside David's wheelchair and put a steady hand on his shoulder. A simple touch that said, I'm here. You're not alone in this. David cried for his old life, for his marriage that had failed, for his children who were pulling away, for the body that had betrayed him, for the future he'd planned that would never happen. He cried until he was exhausted, until there was nothing left inside him but a strange kind of emptiness. When he finally stopped, Tommy handed him tissues without comment. I'm sorry, David said, embarrassed by the breakdown. Don't be. You needed that. Been building up for a while, I'd guess. David nodded, feeling wrung out but also somehow lighter, like he'd been carrying a weight he didn't know was there until it was gone. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Tommy spoke again. You know what I think? He said. I think you're still the guy who built a company from an idea, who solved problems that seemed impossible, who was smart and driven and capable. The wheelchair didn't change any of that. It just changed how you move through the world. It changed everything, David countered. It changed a lot, Tommy agreed. But not everything. Your brain still works. Your experience still matters. Your ability to help people, to mentor, to advise, that's all still there. You've been so focused on what you lost that you haven't looked at what you still have. David wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words, because maybe Tommy had a point. Maybe he'd been so busy grieving his old life that he hadn't considered what kind of new life he could build. I've been thinking, Tommy said, shifting gears. Remember those business courses I mentioned I was taking? David nodded. I want to start my own landscaping business, something small at first, but with room to grow. I've been saving up, doing research, but honestly, I'm terrified. I don't know anything about running a business. He looked at David with a small smile. But you do. David stared at Tommy, caught off guard by the request. You want business advice from me? Not just advice, Tommy said. I want you to help me build this thing from the ground up. Be like a consultant or mentor or whatever you want to call it. I can't pay you, at least not yet, but I'd really value your input. For the first time in months, David felt a spark of something that might have been excitement. You're serious? Completely. I've got the physical labor part down. I'm good with plants, I understand the work. But the business side? Pricing, marketing, managing finances, hiring people eventually. I'm lost. And you? Tommy gestured at him. You built a whole company. You know this stuff. David's mind was already turning, shifting into a mode he hadn't accessed since before the accident. Tell me what you've got so far. They spent the next hour going through Tommy's plans. He had some savings, about $5,000. He had a used truck and basic equipment. He had 3 potential clients lined up, people who knew him from his current work and wanted to hire him for their yards. This is a good start, David said, feeling his professional instincts kicking in. But your pricing is way too low. You're undervaluing your work. I want to be competitive, Tommy said. There's competitive and there's working for free. Let me show you how to calculate your actual costs. They dove into the numbers. David walked Tommy through overhead calculations, profit margins, how to price services to actually make money instead of just breaking even. Tommy took notes frantically, asking questions, challenging assumptions, clearly hungry to learn. David realized he was enjoying himself. Really enjoying himself. This was what he was good at. Strategic thinking, problem solving, seeing the big picture. The wheelchair didn't matter when he was doing this. His legs didn't matter. Only his mind did, and that still worked perfectly. Over the following weeks, helping Tommy became David's focus. They'd spend hours working on the business plan, researching competitors, developing marketing strategies. David used his old contacts to get Tommy connected with suppliers who'd give him better rates. He reviewed Tommy's client proposals and helped him refine his pitch. "You're a natural at the consultation side," David told Tommy one afternoon. "You listen to what people want, you're honest about what's realistic, and you actually care about doing good work." "That's rare," Tommy smiled. "I just want people to be happy with their yards." "Is that too simple?" "That's exactly the right mindset. People don't just want a service, they want someone who cares about the outcome. That's your competitive advantage." Meanwhile, Lily kept coming by for homework help. What started as math support expanded to other subjects. David found himself looking forward to her visits, to her questions and observations, and the way she treated him like a normal person instead of someone broken. "My dad talks about you all the time," Lily said one day while working on a science project. "He says you're helping him make his dream come true." David felt something warm in his chest. When was the last time he'd helped someone make a dream come true? When had he last been part of something being built, rather than just managing what already existed? "Your dad's doing the hard part," David said. "I'm just offering suggestions." "He says you're a genius," Lily countered. "He says you see things other people miss." David changed the subject, uncomfortable with the praise but secretly pleased by it. 3 months into their partnership, Tommy was ready to officially launch his business. David had helped him create a website, design business cards, and develop a social media strategy. They'd worked out a schedule that allowed Tommy to keep his caregiver clients, including David, while taking on landscaping jobs on weekends and evenings. The launch went well. Tommy's existing clients hired him immediately, and word of mouth brought in 3 more within the first month. David monitored the financials closely, helping Tommy avoid common new business mistakes. "You need to hire help," David told him after reviewing the second month's numbers. "You're maxing out your hours and you're going to burn out." "I can't afford to hire anyone yet," Tommy protested. "You can't afford not to. Look at these numbers. You're turning down work because you don't have capacity. That's lost revenue. If you hire someone part-time, even at a basic rate, you can take on more jobs and actually increase profit." They crunched the numbers together until Tommy could see it made sense. Within 2 weeks, he'd hired a part-time helper, a younger guy who was reliable and hardworking. "This is working," Tommy said one evening, looking at his growing client list with amazement. "This is actually working." "Of course it is," David said. "You're providing quality service at fair prices and you care about your work. That's a winning formula." But it wasn't just the business that was changing. David noticed shifts in himself too. He was sleeping better, taking care of himself more, actually looking forward to days instead of just enduring them. His physical therapist commented on the improvement. "Whatever you're doing differently, keep doing it. Your attitude is completely changed, and that's affecting your physical progress too." David knew what had changed. He had purpose again. He was contributing something meaningful. He wasn't just the guy in the wheelchair anymore. He was a mentor, an advisor, someone whose experience and knowledge mattered. One afternoon, his ex-wife called. It had been weeks since they'd last spoken, and David braced himself for more bad news about canceled visits. "The kids want to see you," she said instead, surprising him. "They've been asking." "Really?" David couldn't keep the hope out of his voice. "They heard from someone that you're doing better, that you're helping a friend start a business. They seem curious about what you're up to." When his son and daughter showed up that weekend, David was nervous in a way he hadn't been since the accident. What if they were still uncomfortable? What if the visit was awkward and forced? But Lily was there doing homework when they arrived, and somehow that helped. His kids saw him naturally interacting with this little girl, helping her with a project, making her laugh. They saw him as something other than their disabled father. They saw him as someone who was still doing things, still making a difference. "So you're like a business consultant now?" his son asked, genuinely interested. "Something like that," David said. "Tommy needed help getting his company off the ground, and I had the knowledge." Seemed like a good fit. His daughter looked around the apartment. It was cleaner now, more organized. The curtains were open. There were papers spread out on the table, business plans and marketing materials, signs of activity and purpose. "You seem different," she said carefully. "Better. I'm figuring some things out," David admitted. "It's been a process." They stayed for 3 hours, talked about school and friends and their lives, but also asked David questions about business and careers in the future. When they left, they hugged him. Actually hugged him, not the awkward half-hugs he'd gotten before. After they were gone, Tommy, who'd returned to pick up Lily, smiled at David. "That looked like it went well." "Yeah," David said, still processing. "Yeah, it really did. You know what I think?" Tommy said. "I think they needed to see you as more than your wheelchair. They needed to see you having a life, doing things that matter. Kids can handle a lot, but they struggle with hopelessness. Today they saw hope." David nodded, understanding. He'd needed to see that hope too. As Tommy's business continued to grow, David's role evolved. He wasn't just advising anymore. He was actively involved in strategy and problem-solving, in helping navigate challenges. When Tommy struggled with a difficult client, David coached him through it. When a supplier tried to take advantage, David helped negotiate better terms. When Tommy considered expanding into commercial properties, David ran the numbers and helped him see it was too soon. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Tommy said one day after they'd solved a particularly tricky scheduling problem. "You'd figure it out," David said. "You're smart and resourceful." "Maybe, but it would take a lot longer and probably cost more mistakes." David realized something then. He'd been thinking of this as him helping Tommy, doing a favor for someone who'd helped him. But it was more than that. They were partners in a way. Different roles, different contributions, but both essential to the outcome. "You know," David said slowly, "I've been thinking about making this more official." "What do you mean?" "I mean investing in your business. Being an actual partner, not just an advisor. You need capital to grow, and I have money sitting in accounts not doing anything productive. We could structure it so I provide funding and strategic guidance, you handle operations and field work. Split the profits based on contribution." Tommy stared at him. "You'd want to do that?" "I think we'd be good together. You've got the skills and work ethic. I've got the business knowledge and capital. Neither of us can do it alone as well as we could do it together." For the first time since they'd met, Tommy looked emotional. His eyes were bright and his voice was thick when he spoke. "You're serious?" "Completely. But I need you to understand what you'd be getting into. I'm not just some silent investor. I'd be involved, probably annoyingly so. I'd want regular updates, financial reviews, strategic planning sessions. I'd push you to grow and expand and take on challenges you might not be comfortable with." Tommy laughed, wiping at his eyes. "So basically what you're already doing, but with official paperwork?" "Exactly." They shook on it right there, both knowing this was bigger than just a business arrangement. This was about two people who'd found each other when they both needed it most, building something neither could have built alone. David's lawyer drew up the partnership agreement. David invested $25,000 for a 30% stake in the company. Tommy kept majority ownership but gained the capital and support to really grow. Within 6 months, they'd hired 2 more employees and expanded into 3 neighboring communities. The business was becoming something real, something sustainable, something that could support Tommy and Lily and provide employment for others. And David? He was becoming himself again, not the old version, not the CEO who'd lost everything, a new version, someone who'd taken what seemed like an ending and turned it into a different kind of beginning. A year and a half after Tommy first walked through his door, David sat in a conference room at the rehabilitation center, where he'd spent those first terrible months after the accident. But this time he wasn't there as a patient. He was there as a speaker. The director had reached out months ago, asking if he'd be willing to talk to newly injured patients about life after spinal injury. David had been terrified at first, not sure he had anything worth saying. But Tommy had encouraged him, and eventually he'd agreed to try. Now he looked out at a room full of people in wheelchairs, most looking as lost and angry as he'd felt back then. He recognized that look. The barely contained rage, the grief sitting just beneath the surface, the sense that life as they knew it was over. "My name is David," he began. "About 2 years ago, I had a skiing accident that left me paralyzed from the waist down. At the time, I was running a successful company, had a family, had what I thought was a pretty great life. The accident took most of that away." He paused, seeing people shift uncomfortably. They'd heard speeches before, probably. Inspirational talks about overcoming adversity and staying positive. He wasn't here to give that speech. "I'm not going to tell you that everything happens for a reason," he continued, "or that this is a blessing in disguise. Because honestly, that's garbage. What happened to us isn't fair, and it isn't a gift. It's hard and it hurts, and some days it's going to feel completely overwhelming." He saw several people look up, surprised by his honesty. "I spent months being angry, pushed everyone away. Lost my marriage, lost my company, almost lost myself. I was drowning and didn't see any way out." David glanced at Tommy, who was standing in the back of the room with Lily. Tommy gave him an encouraging nod. "What changed for me was meeting someone who'd been through his own kind of hell and came out the other side. Not because he was especially strong or positive, but because he didn't have a choice. He had a kid who needed him, so he kept going even when it felt pointless." David told them about Tommy, about how his kindness and refusal to treat David like a tragedy had slowly broken through the walls, about how finding a way to be useful again had given him something to work toward. "I'm not saying you need to start a business or find some grand purpose," David said. "What I'm saying is that life isn't over. It's different, and different is hard, but it's not over. You still have skills and experience and value. You can still contribute, still matter, still build something meaningful." He talked about the consulting work he'd started doing, helping other small businesses get off the ground, about reconnecting with his kids, slowly rebuilding that relationship, about discovering adaptive sports he'd never known existed, activities that challenged him in new ways. "The wheelchair doesn't define me," David said. "It's part of my reality now, but it's not who I am. I'm still the guy who loves solving complex problems, still the guy who gets excited about helping businesses grow, still a father trying to figure out how to connect with teenage kids. The wheelchair is just how I get around." After the talk, several people came up to speak with him. Some had questions about practical matters. Others just wanted to say the honesty had helped. One man, probably in his 30s, looked angry when he approached. "That's easy for you to say," the man said bitterly. "You had money. You could afford to invest in a business, to take time figuring things out. Not all of us have that luxury." David nodded, accepting the criticism. "You're right. I did have some financial cushion, though less than you might think after medical bills and divorce. But the principles are the same regardless of money. Finding something you're good at, finding a way to contribute, finding people who see you as more than your disability, that doesn't require wealth." "Easy for you to say," the man repeated, but with less conviction. "Maybe," David admitted, "but a year and a half ago I would have told you the same thing you're telling me now. That other people had it easier, that my situation was uniquely terrible, that there was no point in trying. I was wrong. Not because everything magically got better, but because I was so focused on what I'd lost that I couldn't see what was still possible." The man looked like he wanted to argue more, but didn't. Instead, he wheeled away, and David hoped something he'd said would stick. Tommy approached with Lily, who was carrying a poster she'd made for David's talk. It said, "You got this," in bright colors with stick figures cheering. "That was really good," Tommy said. "You reached some people today." "I don't know," David said, feeling drained. "That guy was right. I did have advantages. You also had the courage to change," Tommy countered. "That doesn't require money. That's all you." On the drive back, David thought about how far he'd come. The business with Tommy was thriving now, employing 6 people and serving over 50 regular clients. David had started a small consulting practice helping other entrepreneurs, particularly those facing challenges or setbacks. He wasn't making the money he'd made before, but he was making enough and finding more satisfaction in the work. His relationship with his kids had improved dramatically. They visited regularly now, actually wanting to spend time with him. His daughter had even asked him to help with her college application essays, valuing his input on presenting herself effectively. "Dad," she'd said recently, "I'm proud of what you've done. After everything that happened, you could have just given up. But you didn't." Those words had meant more to David than any business success ever had. The partnership with Tommy had evolved into genuine friendship. When Tommy's apartment lease was up and he was struggling to find something affordable in a decent school district, David had made a suggestion that surprised both of them. "Move into my guest house," he'd said. "It's just sitting empty. You'd have your own space, Lily would have a yard to play in, and the rent I'd charge would be way less than anything you'd find on the market." Tommy had been hesitant at first, not wanting charity, but David had convinced him it wasn't charity. It was practical. David had the space, Tommy needed it, and honestly, David liked having them around. The house felt less empty with Lily's laughter echoing through the yard and Tommy stopping by in the evenings to discuss business or just talk. They'd become something like a family, this odd little unit of a man in a wheelchair, a single father and a little girl. It worked in ways none of them had expected. David had also started giving back in other ways. He'd set up a scholarship fund for people with disabilities pursuing business degrees. He'd partnered with vocational rehabilitation services to offer free consulting to their clients starting businesses. He'd become an advocate for accessibility in public spaces, using his experience to push for changes. "You've become an activist," his lawyer had joked during one of their meetings about the scholarship fund. "I prefer pain in the butt," David had replied, but he was smiling. He'd found his voice on these issues, realizing he could use his business background and personal experience to actually make a difference. 6 months after his talk at the rehab center, David got an email from the angry man who'd challenged him after the presentation. The email was short. "You were right. I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started looking at what I could do instead of what I couldn't. Got a remote job doing tech support. It's not much, but it's a start. Thanks for the wake-up call." David read the email 3 times, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. That was what mattered, not changing someone's circumstances overnight, but helping them see possibilities they'd been too angry or hurt to notice. One evening, David, Tommy, and Lily were having dinner together in David's kitchen. It had become a weekly tradition, these casual meals where they'd catch up on the week and make plans for the business. "I've been thinking," Tommy said, twirling pasta on his fork. "We should do something for the community. Some kind of event that combines landscaping education with adaptive activities." "What do you mean?" David asked, interested. "Like, we could offer free yard work consultations and demonstrations, but also have adaptive sports equipment for people to try. Show that disability doesn't mean you can't enjoy outdoor activities. Kind of connect what we both care about." David's mind immediately started turning. "That's actually brilliant. We could partner with adaptive sports organizations, maybe get some sponsors involved. Make it a real event." Lily was bouncing in her seat. "Can I help?" "I could make signs." "You can definitely help," Tommy told her, ruffling her hair.